We're joining now with Chris Costa, who's with our sister station out of Maine. Chris, you not only covered that horrible incident back in 2023, but also are following up with this new lawsuit where it sounds like dozens of people are trying to essentially point to the government as someone or an entity that was at fault here, they say, with this mass shooting, missing some signs. Can you walk us through what the latest development is here today?
Yeah, absolutely, Vanessa. So essentially what this is a culmination on the families and the victims' part of this process of filing a lawsuit against really the U.S. Army. What they are arguing is that members of the Army, as well as members of the military hospital where Robert Card, the shooter, where his team members, his fellow soldiers had brought him for initial care. This lawsuit is essentially claiming that not only did the soldiers in Card's unit fail to do their jobs by picking up on some of the cues about his mental health, potential issues of danger, but they're also saying that staff at the Keller Army Hospital, also nearby where they were doing training in New York, also that medical staff failed to recognize those things and hold him. Now, as we did our research going through this, we noticed there were plenty of, when the Army released some details from its investigation into its own entities, right? They were saying, well, we know that these doctors knew about X, Y, and Z, his homicidal tendencies, his potential to have a hit list, and some of his other mental health issues that Robert Card was dealing with. And so the families, and the victims' families rather, and the survivors had been coming together today to file a lawsuit officially. We kind of knew that this was coming, but they are going after the Army and specifically saying that its staff and the medical team that took care of Robert Card were negligent in their approach in notifying the other people who would have been in a sort of like a due diligence type of reporting. Any other hospital staff, his family, Robert Card's family back home, any law enforcement here in Maine that could have potentially intercepted or intervened somehow before Robert Card went on the mass shooting. So that is what the families, the families of the victims and the survivors have filed here today with this lawsuit against the Army.
Now, one of the interesting points that I have seen here is it's a group of firms. So there are multiple law firms that are involved. Some of them are based in Maine. One of them we're seeing is actually based in Texas, and it looks like this specific Texas law firm was actually involved with a different suit from back in 2017, where there was a church shooting that an Air Force service member committed, and apparently they did a suit as well, and the federal government in this case was found to be partly liable, and there was a settlement essentially. So there seems to be at least some recent precedent, relatively recent precedent, for the government essentially being held accountable for instances similar to what happened in Lewiston.
Well, I would say, based on the information that you're talking about, I'm not really remembering exactly, unfortunately, which shooting you're talking about. I think it might have been Sutherland Springs.
You're right. Mm-hmm.
And so all I can really say to that point is I don't know how the courts are going to decide. I don't know if that's going to play into the legal process here for these attorneys here in Maine, if they'll be conferring with the attorneys from Texas to see if they can use that as maybe a point of case law or reference or something as a precedent, as you mentioned, to try to get this to swing their way. But I don't have any insight on that.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like in general, though, I mean, this is something that has hit the community hard and continues to do so. I mean, my understanding is you were there covering, the actual mass shooting that happened in 2023 and have been doing reporting since, very much in depth. I mean, what can you say as far as what you've learned about, what transpired and the impacts that continue to this day following that shooting for your community?
Well, as far as what's transpired, for the most part, we have kind of fleshed out all the details about what led up to the shooting. What were those sort of dropped balls? The phrase you're going to hear over and over again from the families and especially the lawyers really is that the Army dropped the ball. That's what they're claiming. That the Army dropped the ball in multiple instances where they could have intervened with Robert Card. So this has had a pretty wide impact for this community, and it's really run quite a bit of a spectrum. For some people, this was, as you can imagine, incredibly emotional, took away their sense of safety from going to some of these places. The bar itself, it was called Shemengi's Bar and Grill. The owner decided not to reopen it as a bar. Instead, it's been turned into a 24/7 shelter in the city. But you can also imagine for the bowling alley, it's been incredibly tough. They had to completely redo, renovate the inside while trying to maintain their name that is always going to be associated with Robert Card and a mass shooting. But I know that what they've been trying to do by giving it a fresh look, by welcoming people back into the doors, is to say, you know, this did happen in our community. It is part of our history, but it doesn't mean it needs to affect everything we do from here on out. So again, there's some people on one side who have been extremely affected by this, and then there are others who are maybe not quite as vocal about how much this has affected them. There were some people that I spoke to around the 1-year mark who said, no, I don't plan on attending any of the 1-year ceremonies to kind of commemorate. It's just not something I want to be a part of. And so it was hard for us as reporters, right, when we're always trying to get people to talk and share their stories and share how an event has impacted them. There were some people who said, I don't want to talk about it anymore. There were some people who even told me, you know, I'd rather go rent an Airbnb for the entire weekend and be away from sort of those ceremonies. So you had asked me a couple of questions, Vanessa, and I want to make sure that I capture all of them. You'd asked about kind of the latest developments. Really, we had worked on getting everything that led up to the shooting and then all of the documents that kind of came out afterward, whether it be the Army's internal report, the reports that came out of the Saginaw County Sheriff's Office here in Maine detailing how many interactions they had had with CARD, how they had tried to use our state's yellow flag law, which is in itself a difficult process described by both sides, Democrats and Republicans who helped pass it through. They understand that it is a bit of a cumbersome process. That was the word that came up a lot about a year ago, was that it's cumbersome. I can go into more detail on that if you want, but I know that really the focus for us has been, you know, figuring out where did people drop the ball. That was the stuff that came really after the first 48 to 72 hours where, if you remember, there was a shelter-in-place order while there was a manhunt for Robert Card, who officers eventually found in the back of a trailer had taken his own life. A trailer that was a place that he had worked previously at Maine Recycling Corporation. But there was a lot of, there was some fear from people about, hey, I was supposed to go hunting this weekend. This is supposed to be the start of hunting weekend. And you can imagine that the sound of gunshots, even with a hunting tradition in this state, as I'm sure it is in North Carolina, there was some apprehension, some uneasiness about having people out walking around in the woods while officers were looking for the shooter. So our work really focused on what happened in those 24 to 72 hours while they were looking for Card and what he had done, the fallout, obviously, of all the people's lives that had been affected by this, and then on the back end, kind of coming into that timeline over the year leading up, the year since the events, we had been working to kind of ferret out all of that information from the different parties that really had a touch point with Robert Card. And there was one more question you asked me, Vanessa, that I'm sorry, I can't remember. Can you ask it again?
Well, I was, really trying to get at the impacts that we see until, this day, how this has shaped the community and, with such a footprint, like with an incident just like that, I can imagine that to this day there are still some signs. I think you touched on it in the sense that, for example, with the bowling alley, it sounds like they're still kind of dealing with, I don't know if it's safe to say a reputation or just kind of the notoriety of that happening there, but there are probably, reminders of this around the community.
There certainly are, and probably one of the, you could say it's a good thing that came out of this is they had stood up what's called the Maine Resiliency Center. It's a center that uses both state and federal funds after a mass shooting happens from the Department of Justice to set up a center where people can essentially come in and do walk-in free therapy. And they're meeting with their peers. They even had special groups that they would have for people who were there that night at either the bar or the bowling alley, who could connect with each other, know that they were only talking to people who were, in essence, their peers in that regard. And that center has spurred a lot of healing throughout the community. And I've heard from people who have used it over the past 2 years who have said, this has been a critical place for me to kind of open up, express how this has affected me in my life. Because as you can imagine, for some of the survivors, maybe the physical wounds might not be as big, but the mental wounds certainly are. And so that's been a place for them to take a moment, reflect on what they've gone through, have some support from both peers and professionals. And so that's been one way that this has really rippled through the community. You can also imagine, so at the bar, it was a cornhole tournament was happening. If you guys are familiar with the game with the beanbags, and so a lot of cornhole tournaments then came out of that, where people said, we're going to raise money for the victims. There was a very big softball fundraiser because one of the victims, Ron Morin, was an umpire for these recreational softball games of adults who would get together and they'd play games, just I'm sure as you guys do down there. And so he was a fixture in that little community. So each community that everybody, any victim or survivor has been part of, has sort of had this little ripple effect of ways that they can support them. So it might be a softball fundraiser. In one case, it was a local company supporting one of the survivors through a donation. So there have been a lot of different ways that people have tried to reach out. There was also the Victims Fund. So there was money that actually went to the survivors and the victims' families as part of this. But the overall sentiment that I heard from people was that it was obviously not about the money, but just the fact that they have somebody that they can connect with to share what was obviously a very painful experience.
Yeah, I mean, you talked about as well some of the signs that, the plaintiffs say that were overlooked. I heard you reference the fact that he had a tendency to make hit lists. Were there any other notable signs that, these families say should have really been caught, should have really been a red flag about Mr. Card's behavior?
I think that really the big ones are the ones we've touched on, that doctors had documented that Robert Card had homicidal ideations. I'd say that was the one that in my reporting, when I read that in the U.S. Army's report, it was essentially an audit. But it was an investigative report done by an Army investigator who said, they went through kind of each step of the process. When did Card start exhibiting these symptoms, and who intervened with him along the way? So there were talks about, could New York have implemented its red flag law, where they could have separated Robert Card from his guns because he was training in New York? Could New York State Police have done anything when they interviewed him? But really what the plaintiffs in this case are focusing on is the U.S. Army, because of the soldiers in his unit who knew Card intimately, who had instances where he would speak to them and they would say, something doesn't sound right. Even documented instances where he would physically assault some of his fellow unit members. Things that his unit members realized were out of character for Card. And so really the finger pointing is at the members of that unit who, during their there was a commission that was held here in Maine that basically interviewed every one of the players that would have been involved here. When they interviewed his unit commander, he basically, there were certain times where he said he didn't realize that he was supposed to report these type of things and thought he could not because of HIPAA regulations. As we learned through that Army investigation, this was about a year ago now, they could reveal some of those things that were concerns about a person's medical privacy because they involved the potential danger to somebody else, and because they had, I'm going to not be able to reiterate exactly the verbiage, but because they were working for the Department of Defense, and at the time they were under the Army's supervision, there was expectations that those unit members would have reported up the chain of command the issues that they saw with Robert Card. And then they're also, again, taking to task the Keller Army Hospital, which is there in New York, which documented some of the issues, but ultimately, as the Army report investigation found, really failed to take any meaningful action. They allowed him to leave Keller Hospital despite having notices for the staff that he was not ready to leave. So this was difficult. I mean, there is a lot of finger pointing at the Army for what they did and did not do.
I'm curious as well if you've heard from, either through the law firms that are involved with this or the actual family members of those who were affected, have shared with you. I mean, we know what's on paper with the lawsuit, what they're seeking, but did they express what they hope comes from this, should they be successful in court?
So I've not spoken with the attorneys about any type of money or settlement. I don't know that that's necessarily the goal. As you can imagine, the real goal is to make sure that the Army is held accountable, that nothing like this ever happens again. The Army had said during a press conference after it released its report that it was going to review its protocols, that it was going to start implementing certain things to essentially care for service members who were dealing with these type of mental health instances. The plaintiffs feel that that's not been exercised maybe as quickly as it could have possibly been. I don't really know that that's my place to say, because I don't know the inner workings of the Army and when they changed their protocols and operating procedures. But what I can tell you is that these survivors and these victims' families are really feeling like, what has the Army done to show us that they are holding themselves accountable? And if they're not going to hold themselves accountable, then we need to take them to court.
Well, I mean, there's been so many developments, and I know that you've been staying on top of all of them. We've looked over your reporting. I mean, it's been so substantial what you guys have been looking into ever since this, happened. What are you, I guess, looking for on the horizon other than, obviously what comes from this lawsuit? Is there anything else that you're working on, from a journalistic stance of this is another thread that we have yet to pull on that I'm really interested in pursuing? Are there any kind of, I guess, loose ends that might need to be addressed as far as looking into something with this case?
Me personally, Vanessa, one thing that has come up has been, you may have seen a lot of reporting in the New York Times about the blasts that the soldiers go through, that they deal with when they're doing grenade practices or they're doing drills with their weapons. Robert Card was a grenade instructor, and the people who have analyzed his brain are worried about a traumatic brain injury. The scientists at Boston University, after his family donated Robert Card's brain to science to try to figure out, did he have a traumatic brain injury? These experts and these scientists and doctors believe, yes, there is an indication that there was some type of traumatic brain injury, but they can't necessarily connect that to the use of grenades in training. Robert Card never saw any combat, but he was training at Camp Smith in New York, just as hundreds of other Army soldiers do. And so there's been some legislation that's been tried to be pushed forward by lawmakers about how can they regulate the number of times that somebody is subject to those blasts because of the potential impact on the brain. We still have a lot of reporting to do there. We can't necessarily say that 1 + 1 = 2. The Army says in its report that came out about a year ago, they believe that there's no blast impact on Robert Card's brain. They believed that he suffered that traumatic injury when he fell off of a ladder or off of a roof working on a house many years ago. The families don't buy that. The families don't buy that. Scientists, I think, don't buy that. And so there is some more investigation, at least on my end, to do about what happens to a brain that is subject to hundreds, if not thousands, of blasts, even if they are from a distance away when an object like a grenade is thrown. So there are a couple threads along that front, right? Because we're talking about what could lawmakers do to address this issue if the Army won't do it itself, which it says they're going to do. So that's one that's really piqued my curiosity. The other one that's come up is about essentially who was in charge of Robert Card. That's been this sort of like passing the buck, passing the blame around that really never seems to resolve. The Army says that because Robert Card was not serving or not under their supervision because he was no longer in training when all of these other instances occurred, right? When we talk the incidents that led up to the shooting. Contacts with law enforcement, when they would try to investigate, when they had gotten a call from Jeremy Reamer, the unit commander. The sheriff's office had gone to kind of do a door knock. They couldn't really get in touch with Robert Card. He refused to come out of the house. So there's stuff that has come out in our state that has tried to fill those gaps, to fill those loopholes. But I think a big question is who ultimately is responsible for a soldier, even if they're not performing U.S. Army duties. And so there is some finger pointing from the families saying it feels unfair that you can decide when you're supervising a soldier, especially if the impacts on the soldier come from the training they do. So again, there's a little bit of a stretch there. I wouldn't say that that's necessarily, a hard and fast 1 + 1 = 2, but I would say that that's something that I'm looking at to see if there's more we can dive into on that front. Because I know there's a lot of people who are still frustrated by that concept, those gaps in the law that could have potentially intervened.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. Those are some really interesting threads to follow up on and look into. So I'll definitely be interested to see what your reporting comes up with. Chris Costa, this was really interesting, and we just thank you so much for your time here joining us on Live Impact News and kind of not only just filling us in on the very latest, but also all of the context that you have gathered in the last 2 years regarding this case. It's really, I can tell, a labor of love at this point for the community, making sure that the community is getting what it needs as far as the information, from the stories.
We appreciate it. I know there are a lot of people out there who wish they had had more information at the time. And so it kind of feels like it's our job at this point to give them as much information as we can now that we have access to it. 'Cause as you can imagine, during that 48 to 72 hours, there were a lot of things we did not know. And slowly these things have come out. And some of them have been really, really important, and we need to expand upon them to explain them fully. And then there are others that are just kind of little nuggets along the way that kind of add to the totality to it. So, excuse me, we even did a whole hour-long documentary about what led up to the shooting and then what the commission was doing in order to figure out how, and not that it was its job to come up with legislation or recommendations, but really just to kind of ferret out the facts. And then I think it's kind of lawmakers' jobs, the people in power, to make changes based on what's come out of all of the recommendations, all of the investigations, all the reports. And then as journalists, right, it's our job to make sure that we hold them accountable to actually taking that action. So yeah, it's been a labor of love. It has been a labor of love. A lot of people up there that I really care about, that I see on a regular basis. They call Maine a big small town. And so Lewiston might be one of the top 5 largest cities in the state, but it's still full of people who, I get a text message from every week. So yeah, a lot of good people up there.
Yeah, well, glad to see the work that you're doing and the impact that it's having. Chris Costa, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Vanessa. Appreciate it.
All right.